if you look at this trajectory, so what's the worst case scenario? Like a black swan or a white swan, call it whatever you want. But do you have to mention war to get you afraid of something? Or do you see a worst case scenario where you actually have to protect your downside?
Well, of course, I mean, the situation in the Ukraine, or maybe potentially Taiwan, China, I mean, these are concerning developments, not just on a let's say personal level, but also for the industry. It will have implications. Of course, I mean, we as a company have contracts, and then vessels will go different routes. The Ukraine and Taiwan in itself doesn't really ruin the picture from a global trade perspective, but it will obviously affect a trading pattern. It will affect the way we operate vessels. Of course, always very important. Actually, the most important aspect from our perspective is crew safety, right? I mean, we need to make sure that we operate very safely and that our crew is protected, and the well-being of the crew is super important. So there are implications of that nature that could change the picture. But I mean, as an example, not a war in war terms, but a trade war, as we've seen between China and the US, had an impact on the market. Not necessarily really on the pricing, but on sentiment and on people not being sure whether to commit into capex or the likes, and then it had an effect on container shipping. So that is a risk. Again, the longer the contracts, the better it is then also evenly shared along the supply chain. If we just had ships on short contracts, we would be way more exposed. Now we have a good backlog, and also the liner companies, Maersk and others, they also have longer contracts now. So there's more visibility on the ship owner side, on the liner operator side, and now the, let's say, risk is more shared also with shippers and freight forwarders because they have to commit to longer contracts. So I think the industry has stabilized. The balance sheets also of owners and in particular liner companies has improved significantly. People always look at the high rates and say, oh, can that be sustainable? Well, it can if everyone uses the capital or allocates the capital in a way that they also de-risk their balance sheet and do not expose themselves to more and more risk. And that is certainly something that we will do, not just to pay out dividends, but also to de-risk the balance sheet. And the good news is the cash flow is so rich that we can afford it, and the liners do the same. So I think this is very important going forward. But to your point, obviously the certain developments globally raise concerns, but I don't think at this stage that there's any black swan tangibly there, but you never know. We haven't seen COVID coming, and in the beginning it was a nightmare for container shipping, and now it's obviously the opposite for container shipping as such.
Do you like to use these scenarios in like a probability sense, or do you more fancy the path dependency? Because probabilities are so hard in unknowns, but if you have path dependency, it's easier to kind of like connect the dots if something were to happen.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but it's difficult to answer because in the end, to some extent, you look at probability, and then it's obviously likelihood of occurrence, and then materiality of effect, right? And we obviously, when looking at our contracts, try to make sure that we are as good protected as possible, so not to have any war clauses in there or the like, to actually have certain restrictions in terms of trading area if it gets declared. You have these war risk clauses, etc. So all of that is part of the contractual agreement. So you need to be very careful and monitor these very, very carefully. And that's how we would address it. But again, some of these things, since shipping is a global industry, you have to look at the global map. You cannot just look at your one country where you sell, I don't know, bicycles in a shop in Oslo or Tromsø for that matter, or in Hamburg. So you really have to think about interdependencies and potential scenarios globally, and that's what makes shipping so exciting.
Definitely. So you mentioned the people, and I think it's interesting to highlight them a bit, because so many people always say that shipping is an asset play, right? But when you hire so many people, you have to say it's a people play as well. But then the question becomes, how do you become great at treating your people? Because maybe COVID shows that companies can't really move the needle because they are regulated away and there's international laws. So I don't know if you can just rent a helicopter and get them out if you need to change the crew, right? So maybe spend just a couple of minutes explaining this dynamic where every ship owner says they want to take care of their people, right? But can they move the needle to the extent they should be able to move the needle when needed?
I mean, the short answer is during the pandemic, it was very challenging for everyone. I mean, we also, together with our crew managers, we also hired or rented planes and brought people from A to B. Yet, the whole regulatory and restrictive environment changed overnight. So what was possible and the viable path yesterday was then forbidden the other day. So really adapting to new rules and new schemes. It was also not countrywide. It was, for example, in China, you have local rules that apply overnight. So it's really challenging. Communication is important with the crew to make sure that everyone sees that you are trying your best. Yet that might not be enough to achieve the goal that you want to achieve, in particular during a pandemic, right? So I think that is important. We have pushed a lot to get the crews vaccinated as soon as possible, to do whatever is within our capabilities in a way, together with let's say partners. And the good thing is that the industry, since it's global and everyone works globally, the industry is also quick in supporting certain efforts. Yet, given the complexity of different governments, etc., it's not easy to find common ground within a short period of time. So one can just say, you need to try to be on top of things. You will never be on top of things eventually, but to work hard and to listen to people is key, and to try your best. I mean, for example, on crew costs, I mean, we have had higher crew costs and well, we will have higher crew cost also next year, because it's so important to make sure that the people, have a solid, let's say, working environment, considering the circumstances.
If we take a crew member perspective, how can they review their companies? Because obviously it's a global demand for their services. I don't think maybe it's the salary should be pretty even. I'm just expecting. I don't know the numbers, but from a crew member perspective, what should they think about when deciding which company to work for, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes you can also be unlucky, so to say, because it's not. I wouldn't. I mean, obviously there are good companies and less good companies in a way they treat people, of course. But I think it's as I said, it's also a lot of that has to do with regions. I mean, if you trade in a region and you are allocated to a vessel that trades in a region that is more challenging from that perspective, it has nothing to do with the company. Yet, I mean, crew, there are huge crew organizations. They have a lot of platforms, own Facebook groups or other Facebook-like media where they exchange, their experiences and also their takeaways from having worked for certain companies. So I think there's quite a good transparency on, what is a good company to join and what not. I think the crew members are very well connected, so it's important to consider this, and it's important to treat everyone as good as you can, because it will backfire otherwise. And I think this is a very important, at least part of our agenda, to make sure that everyone gets respected and gets treated as good as possible. So I think there is quite a transparency to answer your question.